History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 7 Asia's Response to a Europeanizing World. Discontented exiles drew on support from Chinese businessmen abroad, of whom there were many, for the Chinese had always been great traders. They helped Sun Yat-sen to form in 1905 in Japan a revolutionary alliance aiming at the expulsion of the Manchus and the initiation of Chinese rule, a republican constitution, land reform. It sought to conciliate the foreigners at this stage, a wise tactical move. Its program showed the influence of Western thinkers, notably that of the English radical John Stuart Mill and the American economic reformer Henry George. Once again, the West was providing the stimulus and some of the ideological baggage of a Chinese reform movement, and it was the launching of the party eventually to emerge as dominant in the Chinese Republic. Its formation, though, may well be thought less significant than another event of the same year, the abolition of the traditional examination system. More than any other institution, the examination system had held Chinese civilization together by providing the bureaucracy it recruited with its internal homogeneity and cohesion. This would not quickly wane, but the distinction between the mass of Chinese subjects and the privileged ruling class was now gone. Meanwhile, returning students from abroad, dissatisfied with what they found and no longer under the necessity of accommodating themselves to it by going through the examination procedure, if they wished to enter the government service, exercised a profoundly disturbing influence. They much increased the rate at which Chinese society began to be irradiated by Western ideas. Together with the soldiers in a modernized army, more and more of them looked to revolution for a way ahead. There were a number of rebellions, some directed by Sun Yat-sen from Indochina with French connivance. Before the empress and her puppet emperor died on successive days in 1908. The event raised new hopes, but the Manchu government continued to drag its feet over reform. On the one hand, it made important concessions of principles and promoted the flow of students abroad. On the other, it showed that it could not achieve a decisive break with the past or surrender any of the imperial privileges of the Manchus. Perhaps more could not have been asked for. By 1911, the situation has deteriorated badly. The gentry class showed signs of losing its cohesion. It was no longer to back the dynasty in the face of subversion as it had done in the past. Governmentally, there existed a near stalemate of internal power, the dynasty effectively controlling only a part of China. In October, a revolutionary headquarters was discovered at Hankow. There had already been revolts which had been more or less contained earlier in the year. This precipitated one which at last turned into a successful revolution. Sun Yat-sen, whose name was used by the early rebels, was in the United States at the time and was taken by surprise. The course of the revolution was decided by the defection from the regime of its military commanders. The most important of these were Yuan Shikai. When he turned on the Manchus, the dynasty was lost. The mandate of heaven had been withdrawn, and on 12th February 1912, the 6-year-old and last Manchu emperor abdicated. A republic had already been proclaimed, with Sun Yat-sen its president, and a new nationalist party soon appeared behind him. In March, he resigned the presidency to Yuan Shikai, thus acknowledging where power really lay in the new republic. and inaugurating a new phase of Chinese government in which an ineffective constitutional regime at Peking disputed the practical government of China by warlords. China had still a long way to travel before she would be a modern nation state. Nonetheless, she had begun the half century's march which would recover for her an independence lost in the 19th century to foreigners. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was little to show a superficial observer that Japan might adapt more successfully than China to challenges from the West. She was, to all appearances, deeply conservative. Yet, much had already changed since the establishment of the shogunate, and there were signs that the changes would cut deeper and faster as the years went by. It was a paradox that this was in part attributable to the success of the Tokugawa era itself. It had brought peace. An obvious result was that Japan's military system became old fashioned and inefficient. The samurai themselves were evidently a parasitic class, warriors. There was nothing for them to do except to cluster in the castle towns of their lords, consumers without employment, a social and economic problem. The prolonged peace also led to the surge of growth, which was the most profound consequence of the Tokugawa era. Japan was already a semi developed, diversifying society with a money economy, the beginnings of a quasi capitalist structure in agriculture, which eroded the old feudal relationships and a growing urban population. Osaka, the greatest mercantile center, had been 3 and 400,000 inhabitants in the last years of the shogunate. Edo may have had 1 million. These great centers of consumption were sustained by financial and mercantile arrangements which had grown enormously in scale and complication since the 17th century. They made a mockery of the old notion of the inferiority of the merchant order. Even their techniques of salesmanship were modern. The 18th century house of Mitsui, 2 centuries later, still a pillar of Japanese capitalism, gave free umbrellas decorated with their trademark to consumers and customers caught in their shops by the rain. Many of these changes registered the creation of new wealth from which the shogunate had not itself benefited, largely because it was unable to tap it at a rate which kept pace with its own growing needs. The main revenue was the rice tax, which flowed through the lords, and the rate at which the tax was levied remained fixed at the level of the 17th century assessment. Taxation, therefore, did not take away the new wealth arising from better cultivation and land reclamation, and because this remained in the hands of the better off peasants and village leaders, this led to sharpening contrasts in the countryside. The poorer peasantry was often driven to the labor markets of the town. This was another sign of disintegration in the feudal society. In the towns, which suffered from an inflation made worse by the shogunate's debasement of the coinage, only the merchants seemed to prosper. A last effort of economic reform failed in the 1840s. The lords grew poorer and their retainers lost confidence. Before the end of the Tokugawa, some samurai were beginning to dabble in trade. Their share of their lord's tax yield was still only that of their 17th century predecessors. Everywhere could be found impoverished, politically discontented swordsmen, and some aggrieved families of great lords who recalled the days when their race had stood on equal terms with the Tokugawa. The obvious danger of this potential instability was all the greater because insulation against Western ideas had long since ceased to be complete. A few learned men had entrusted themselves in books which entered Japan through the narrow aperture of the Dutch trade. Japan was very different from China in its technical receptivity. The Japanese are sharp witted and quickly learn anything they see, said a 16th century Dutchman. They had soon grasped and exploited, as the Chinese never did, the advantages of European firearms and began to make them in quantity. They also copied the European clocks, which the Chinese treated as toys. They were eager to learn from Europeans as unhampered by their traditions as the Chinese seemed bogged down in theirs. On the great fiefs, there were notable schools or research centers of Dutch studies. The shogunate itself had authorized the translation of foreign books, an important step in so literate a society for education in Tokugawa. Japan had been almost too successful. Even young samurai were beginning to inquire about Western ideas. The islands were relatively small and communications good, so that new ideas got about easily. Thus, Japan's posture when she suddenly had to face a new and unprecedented challenge from the West was less disadvantageous than that of China. The first period of Western contact with Japan had ended in the 17th century with the exclusion of all but a few Dutchmen allowed to conduct trade from an island at Nagasaki. Europeans had not been able to challenge this outcome. That this was not likely to continue to be the case was shown in the 1840s by the fate of China, which some of Japan's rulers observed with increasing alarm. The Europeans and North Americans seemed to have both a new interest in breaking into Asian trade and new and irresistible strength to do it. The Dutch king warned the shogun that exclusion was no longer a realistic policy. But there was no agreement among Japan's rulers about whether resistance or concession was better. Finally, in 1851, the President of the United States sent a naval officer, Commodore Perry, to open relations with Japan. Under him, the first foreign squadron to sail into Japanese waters entered Edo Bay in 1853. In the following year, it returned, and the first of a series of treaties with foreign powers was made by the shogunate. Perry's arrival could be seen in Confucian terms as an omen that the end of the shogunate was near. No doubt, some Japanese saw it that way. Yet, this did not at once follow, and there were a few years of somewhat muddled response to the barbarian threat. Japan's rulers did not straightaway come around to the wholehearted policy of concession. There was one further attempt to expel foreigners by force, and Japan's future course was not set until well into the 1860s. Within a few years, the success of the West was nonetheless embodied in and symbolized by a series of so called unequal treaties. Commercial privileges, extraterritorially for Western residents, the presence of diplomatic representatives, and restrictions on Japanese export of opium were the main concessions won by the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands. Soon afterwards, the shogunate came to an end. Its inability to resist the foreigner was one contributing factor, and another was the threat from the two great aggregations of feudal power, which had already begun to adopt Western military techniques in order to replace the Tokugawa by a more effective and centralized system under their control. There was fighting between the Tokugawa and their opponents. but it was followed not by a relapse into disorder and anarchy, but by a resumption of power by the imperial court and administration in 1868 in the so called Meiji Restoration. The re emergence of the emperor from centuries of ceremonial seclusion and the widespread acceptance of the revolutionary renewal which followed was attributable above all to the passionate desire of most literate Japanese to escape from a shameful inferiority to the West, which might have led them to share the fate of the Chinese and Indians. In the 1860s, both the Bakufu and some individual clans had already sent several missions to Europe. Anti-foreign agitation was dropped in order to learn from West the secrets of its strength. There was a paradox in this. As in some European countries, a nationalism rooted in a conservative view of society was to dissolve much of the tradition it was developed to defend. The transference of the court to Edo was the symbolic opening of the Meiji Restoration and the regeneration of Japan. Its indispensable first stage was the abolition of feudalism. What might have been difficult and a bloody business was made simple by the voluntary surrender to the emperor of their lands by the four great clans, who set out their motives in a memorial they addressed to the emperor. They were returning to the emperor what had originally been his. They said, so that a uniform rule may prevail throughout the empire. Thus, the country will be able to rank equally with the other nations of the world. This was a concise expression of the patriotic ethic which was to inspire Japan's leaders for the next half century and was widely spread in a country with a large degree of literacy, where local leaders could make possible the acceptance of national goals to a degree impossible elsewhere. True, such expressions were not uncommon in other countries. What was peculiar to Japan was the urgency which observation of the fate of China lent to the program. The emotional support given to the idea by Japanese social and moral tradition, and the fact that in the imperial throne there was available within the established structure a source of moral authority not committed merely to maintaining the past. These conditions made possible a Japanese 1688, a conservative revolution opening the way to radical change. Rapidly, Japan adopted many of the institutions of Western government and Western society. A prefectorial system of administration, posts, a daily newspaper, a ministry of education, military conscription, the first railway, religious toleration, and the Gregorian calendar all arrived within the first 5 years. A representative system of local government was inaugurated in 1879, and 10 years later, a new constitution set up a bicameral parliament. A peerage had already been created in preparation for the organization of the upper house. In fact, this was less revolutionary than might appear, given the strong authoritarian strain in the document. At about the same time, too, the innovatory passion was beginning to show signs of flagging. The period when things Western were a craze was over. No such enthusiasm was to be seen again until the second half of the 20th century. In 1890, an imperial rescript on education subsequently to be read on great days to generations of Japanese school children enjoined the observation of the traditional Confucian duties of filial piety and obedience and sacrifice of self to the state if need be. Much, perhaps the most important part of the old Japan was to survive the Meiji Revolution and was to do so very obviously. This is in part the secret of the modern Japan. But much too had gone. Feudalism could never be restored, generously compensated with government stock, though the lords might be. Another striking expression of the new direction was the abolition of the old ordered class system. Care was shown in removing the privileges of the samurai. Some of them could find compensation in the opportunities offered to them by the new bureaucracy. In business, no longer to be a demeaning activity, and in the modernized army and navy. For these foreign instruction was sought, because the Japanese sought proven excellence. Gradually, they dropped their French military advisors and took to employing Germans after Franco-Prussian War. The British provided instructors for the navy. Young Japanese were sent abroad to learn at first hand other secrets of the wonderful and threatening puissance of the West. It is still hard not to be moved by the ardor of many of these young men and of their elders, and impossible not to be impressed by their achievement, which went far beyond Japan and their own time. The Shishi, as some of the most passionate and dedicated activists of reform were called, later inspired national leaders right across Asia, from India to China. Their spirit was still at work in the young officers of the 1930s, who were to launch the last and most destructive wave of Japanese imperialism. The crude indexes of the success of the reformers are the economic ones, but they are very striking. They built on the economic benefits of the Tokugawa peace. It was not only the borrowing of Western technology and expertise which ensured the release in Japan of a current of growth achieved by no other non Western state. The country was lucky in being already well supplied with entrepreneurs who took for granted the profit motive, and it was undoubtedly richer than, say, China. Some of the explanation of the great leap forward by Japan lay also in the overcoming of inflation and the liquidation of feudal restraints, which had made it hard to tap Japan's full potential. The first sign of change was a further increase in agricultural production, little though the peasants who made up four-fifths of the population in 1868 benefited from it. Japan managed to feed a growing population in the 19th century by bringing more land under cultivation for rice and by cultivating existing fields more intensively. Though the dependence on the land tax lessened as a bigger portion of the revenue could be found from other sources, it was still upon the peasant that the cost of the new Japan fell almost heavily. As late as 1941, Japanese farmers saw few of the gains from modernization. Relatively, they had fallen behind their ancestors only a century earlier, had a life expectancy and income approximating to that of their British equivalents. But even by 1900, this was far from true of their successors. There were few non agricultural resources. It was the increasingly productive tax on land which paid for investment. Consumption remained low, though there was not the suffering of, say, the later industrialization process of Stalin's Russia. A high rate of saving, 12% in 1900, spared Japan dependence on foreign loans but again restricted consumption. This was the other side of the balance sheet of expansion, whose credit entries were clear enough. The infrastructure of a modern state an indigenous arms industry, a usually high credit rating in the eyes of foreign investors, and a big expansion of cotton spinning and other textiles by 1914. In the end, a heavy spiritual cost had to be paid for these successes. Even while seeking to learn from the West, Japan turned inward. The foreign religious influences of Confucianism and even at first Buddhism were attacked by the upholders of the state. Shintoist cult, which even under the shogunate had begun to stress and enhance the role of the emperor as the embodiment of the divine. The demands of loyalty to the emperor as a focus of the nation came to override the principles embodied in the new constitution, which might have been developed in liberal directions in the different cultural settings. The character of the regime expressed itself less in its liberal institutions than in the repressive actions of the imperial police. Yet it is difficult to see how an authoritarian emphasis could, in fact, have been avoided given the two great tasks facing the statesmen of the Meiji Restoration. The modernization of the economy meant not planning in the modern sense but a strong governmental initiative and harsh fiscal policies. The other problem was order. The imperial power had once before gone into eclipse because of its failure to meet the threat of on this front. And now there were new dangers because not all conservatives could be reconciled to the new model Japan. Discontented Ronin, ruthless samurai without masters, were one source of trouble. Another was peasant misery. There were scores of agrarian revolts in the first decade of the Meiji era. In the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, the government's new conscript forces showed that they could handle conservative resistance. It was the last of several rebellions against the restoration of the last great challenge from conservatism. The energies of the discontented samurai were gradually to be siphoned off into the service of new state. But this did not mean that the implications for Japan were all beneficial. They intensified in certain sectors of the national life an assertive nationalism which was to lead eventually to aggression abroad. Immediately, this was likely to find expression not only in resentment of the West but also in the imperial ambitions directed towards the nearly Asian mainland. Modernization at home and adventure abroad were often in tension in Japan after the Meiji Restoration, but in the long run, they pulled in the same direction. The popular and democratic movements especially felt the tug of imperialism. China was the predestined victim and was to be served much more harshly by her fellow Asians than by any of the Western states. At first, she was threatened only indirectly by Japan, just as China's supremacy over the dependencies on her borders was challenged in Tibet, Burma, and Indochina by Europeans. So the Japanese menaced it in the ancient empire of Korea, long a tributary of Peking. Japanese interests there went back a long way. In part, they were strategic. The Straits were the place where the mainland was nearest, but the Japanese were also concerned over the possible Far Eastern ambitions of Russia, particularly in Manchuria, and over China's inability to resist them. In 1876, an overt move was made under the threat of military and naval action like those deployed by the Europeans against China and by Perry against Japan. The Koreans agreed to open three of their ports to the Japanese and to exchange diplomatic representatives. This was an affront to China. Japan was treating Korea as an independent country and negotiating with it over the head of imperial court in Peking, which claimed sovereignty over Korea. Some Japanese wanted even more. They remembered earlier Japanese invasions of Korea and successful piracy on its coasts and coveted the mineral and natural wealth of the country. The statesmen of the Restoration did not at once give way to such pressure, but in a sense they were only making haste slowly. In the 1890s, another step forward was taken which led Japan into her first major war since the Restoration, and it was against China. It was sweepingly successful, but was followed by national humiliation when, in 1895, a group of Western powers forced Japan to accept a peace treaty much less advantageous than the one she had imposed on Chinese, which had included a declaration of Korea's independence.